Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues from the Secretariat. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today and to present some of the key elements of the project proposal for Kyrgyzstan to build national ETF for the Paris Agreement, which will be supported by the JEF CBIT program. Next slide, please. In my presentation, I will not only highlight the key elements of the project proposal, but also the steps that we have taken in order to ensure that the proposal is tailored to the national circumstances of the country, that it meets the country needs, and that at the end we will have country ownership of the results. Next slide, please. I wish to start with a few words of a background, focusing on climate policy of Kyrgyzstan. What is some highlights of the ETF, and about CBIT and the role of UNDP. Climate change is a critical issue for Kyrgyzstan's development, as the country is highly exposed to climate change and its worst consequences. And also the country has relatively low adaptive capacity. Country is a member of all three climate treaties that you see on the slide, and it submitted its updated NDC in October 2021. Our comparative assessment shows that it's a rather ambitious NDC that contains both unconditional and conditional component for a percentage reduction of emissions below the baseline in both 2025 and 2030. Kyrgyzstan also submitted its first biennial update report and the national inventory report in December 2022. Currently, the country is in the course of preparation of its fourth national communication and its first BTR under the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Already when countries negotiated, next slide, please. Already when countries negotiated the Paris Agreement, it was very clear that the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or ETF, offers much more rigorous requirements to countries with regard to scope of reporting and also in terms of the frequency of reporting compared to the existing requirement under the convention. And therefore, reaching an agreement on ETF was quite a milestone in negotiation process. Vlad already provided very comprehensive overview of the ETF, but I would like to focus only on three elements. The first is that it's a mandatory requirement for countries under the Paris Agreement, or in legal language, this is a shell requirement. Secondly, the importance of the ETF is underlined because it promotes effective implementation of the Paris Agreement towards its goals, helps to build mutual trust and confidence that everybody is doing their bit, and contribution to the global fight on climate change. And importantly for developing countries, this is the system that is essential in order to attract climate finance by developing countries. Also, as Vlad mentioned, the ETF provides a key input to the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, which essentially is the assessment of the collective progress of countries under the agreement. But it's also a very important process because it charters the way forward towards more ambitious implementation until the goals of the Paris Agreement are met. Preparation of the ETF doesn't start from scratch. It builds on the collective experience of all countries, and it also takes into account different capabilities and national circumstances of the countries. Essentially, establishing an ETF requires a lot of activities, but I wish to underline four essential steps. The first is setting up adequate transparency governance structures. The second is developing and implementing measuring and reporting methodologies and tools. then updating and implementing and integrating new data and information flows, and last but not least, having in place necessary expert capacity. Next slide, please. Now moving to CBIT. As I have mentioned, the ETF requirements are much more rigorous and demanding compared to the MRP requirements under the convention. And reaching an agreement on the support that is needed to be provided to developing countries in order to put in place such system was the critical element in negotiations in Paris that led to breaking the impasse on negotiations and made a huge contribution to building consensus on the outcome of the Paris conference. Then one of the key decisions which were taken in Paris was the launch of the CBIT, which stands for Capacity Building Initiative on Transparency. It was launched in 2015 under the Global Environmental Facility, and Kyrgyzstan is planning to be part of this initiative. Already we have undertaken some preparations, including analysis, assessment, and survey among the key stakeholders. Then moving to the role of UNDP vis-a-vis CBIT, I wish to emphasize that action on climate change have been an essential part of the UNDP activities globally, and also in Kyrgyzstan, which is demonstrated in a number of recent projects that were essential to advance climate policy in the country. This includes supporting global initiative Climate Promise, preparing updated NDC submission and NDC implementation plan, preparing a national adaptation plan, working in close cooperation with developing partners, and we have here today some representatives, GIZ, for example. Together with other relevant projects which have been implemented in the country, such as the CBIT GSP regional project in Central Asia, the UNDP projects that are enumerated in the slide provide a very important opportunity to capitalize on the results, to maximize the synergies, and avoid duplication of effort. Next slide, please. We started the preparation with an overview and assessment of institutional, legal, and policy framework for climate change in the country. And in my next slide, you see the key ministries and bodies that are engaged in the coordination of climate change processes and policies, and also engaged in reporting under the Climate Change Convention. And this includes the Ministry of National Resources, Ecology and Technical Supervision, the Coordination Council on Climate Change, Ecology and Sustainable Development, the Climate Finance Center under the Cabinet of Ministers, which has a key role in attracting climate finance, and importantly also National Statistical Committee, Kyrgyz Hydromet, sectoral ministries and agencies, each of which are engaged in different aspects of climate change mitigation and adaptation policy. Next slide, please. Next slide illustrates the institutional framework that this country has in place already for the preparation of national inventory. Perhaps it's a bit too early to say that this framework is sustainable because we don't know yet whether the system provides sufficient resources in order to maintain and enhance the capacity of all stakeholders engaged in the process. But it is essential that we already have one key element of the big puzzle of the ETF. Why I'm saying big puzzle of the institutional framework of the ETF is because according to provisions of Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, the ETF should cover not only inventory, but also tracking progress of NDCs, which is a more mostly policy-related component of the overall ETF. Next slide, please. The country also has legislation and policies in place to advance climate policy. in particular law on the state policy and regulation on emissions and removals on GHG emissions from 2007. As you can see, it's a pretty old instrument, but it's now in the process of being reviewed and eventually upgraded. There is also a policy framework in place. Importantly, the National Development Strategy of Kyrgyzstan for 2018-2040, and also the relatively recent presidential decree from 2021 on measures to secure ecological safety and climate resilience. When we were preparing the project proposal, we took into consideration that Kyrgyzstan attaches great importance to consideration of gender issues, and importantly, impact the most vulnerable part of the population, which are manifested in a number of documents, and importantly, in the national strategy to achieve the gender equality by 2030. All these elements of the legal and policy framework are reflected in the recent documents and reports which the country has submitted to the UNFCCC. Importantly, the third national communication, updated national determined contribution, national GHG inventory, and the first biennial update report in associated capacity building efforts. Next slide, please. In addition to reviewing and assessing the information contained in the documents that I just listed, we have also run a very comprehensive survey among the key stakeholders from most of the institutions that have been already engaged in climate policy preparation, formulation, implementation, and also in reporting, which you see on my next slide. Conducting this survey was quite important to get very detailed and comprehensive bottom-up information that helped to identify some of the issues in the existing state of the MRV. At the very high level, this includes lack of sufficient clarity on the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders, engagement of many experts with the sense that coordination was not sufficient, UNFCCC report being prepared on ad hoc basis. Stakeholders engagement also happened on ad hoc basis, and there was a lack of more systematic approach to their engagement. Lack of sufficient number of staff, and also we identified the number of specific gaps in relation to mitigation, adaptation, and support. Next slide, please. Arguably, even more important than identifying the issues and gaps was identifying the needs for the country. And we clustered these needs into two big groups. The first are needs in relation to coordination, legal and institutional arrangements, and data quality. And here we included needs such as enhancing effectiveness and coordination, updating the legal and regulatory frameworks, transition to regular country-owned and partly self-funded arrangement, addressing any gaps in communication, in data and information between different ministries and agencies which are engaged in climate policy and also in reporting processes. And finally, strengthening and formalizing institutional arrangements for data collection, analysis, and reporting. Next slide, please. The second group of needs concerns technical capacity, new methodologies, guidelines, and tools, and stakeholders engagement. And this is the area of needs which is very closely related to the topic of the event in which we are engaged today. And they include strengthening of technical capacity and reporting in all areas which are covered by the ETF, moving to the full use of the 2006 IPCC guidelines, and where possible, moving to more elaborated, higher tier methods for assessing of emissions and removals at least for part of the key sources of emissions. And finally, ensuring engagement of stakeholders and consideration of gender issues in the ETF process. Next slide, please. Both assessing available information and the survey help us to shape the vision of what should be the ETF for Kyrgyzstan, and which should be in the heart of the project proposal. But also, this is a vision that helps to bring together views and ideas of different stakeholders, and in the same time fit into the requirements by the UNFCCC. And therefore, it comes to no surprise that the first important element of this vision is that this ETF of Kyrgyzstan should be a system that meets the legal requirements of the Paris Agreement and should be designed to enable evolution and improvement over time. And this is essential. Vlad already mentioned that nobody expects the system to be perfect from the very beginning, but it's a system that allows for learning and improvement. It should be a system that allows to prepare on a regular basis NDCs and their updates by harnessing the lessons from tracking progress in implementation of policies and activities that are included in the existing NDCs, and by identifying options and opportunities for increasing ambition of subsequent NDCs on the pathway to low carbon and climate resilient development. And finally, it is also a system that enables climate policy making by helping to define and coordinate process of policy formulation, identifying incentives and regulatory instruments, by enabling evidence-based and data-driven policy making on climate change, and updating plans and strategies that are included in the NDCs and are related to the concept of achieving carbon neutrality, such as the national adaptation plans, long-term strategies, and other related documents. Next slide, please. I'm moving to the final part of my presentation, and I'm not trying to scare you by showing this very comprehensive chart, but this is a chart that illustrates how we applied the theory of change, which is a standard methodology for the JEF and in particular for CBIT to identify the key elements of the project proposals. What is, it's my favorite topic, so I can speak hours on theory of change, but what I want to emphasize that theory of change is essentially a tool that allows to develop credible pathways, which allow us to move from the current state of affairs, which is shown on the bottom of the slide, which is the core problem, to solving this problem and achieving the objective, which is on the top of the slide, through moving through these credible pathways through different elements of this whole system. And in this presentation, I wish to highlight only 3 elements of what you have seen in this slide. Next slide, please. The first is the objective of, the first is the objective, and the second are the outcomes of the proposed JEF CBIT project. And you should not be surprised that both objective and outcome are very closely linked to the vision that I just highlighted. So there is a kind of inevitable repetition, but still I wish to highlight that the key objective of the project proposal is to establish an ETF under the Paris Agreement in the country that meets the legal requirement and which at the same time enables climate change policy making that is geared to higher ambition and support the updates and the implementation of NDCs, national adaptation plans, and other documents. Then this objective will be, once it is achieved, it will allow to have as two outcomes of our project. The first outcome at the end of the project is that Kyrgyzstan puts in place an ETF that fully meets the legal requirements and enable evolution and improvement over time. And the second outcome is that the ETF enables periodic update of NDCs, NAPs, and their implementation. It will allow the use of climate information and analysis from the system for the purposes of data-driven climate policy making on mitigation and adaptation. And this is also a system that would allow to track the impact of climate change to the most vulnerable social groups, including gender and poverty, and would allow to monitor the national progress to respond to this impact. Next slide, please. In order to deliver the two outcomes that I highlighted, we plan several outputs for each one of these outcomes. Regarding outcome one, we envisage the following outputs. Firstly, legal, regulatory, institutional frameworks are updated and national institutions are strengthened. Secondly, data and information flows are designed and implemented to ensure effective functioning of the system. Third, an integrated ETF platform is developed and operationalized to collect data, information, tools, and results from the assessment to allow for more transparent presentation of data and information also to broad public, and to maintain all this information for which to reflect the actual state of affairs of a climate change policy in the country. Then we have two similar outputs. Technical support tools, methods, data, and data system are provided. Number one, with regard to submission of GHG inventory, and number two, with regard to tracking progress of implementation of NDCs. Then we have output 6, expert capacity is built to coordinate ETF activities and conduct analysis, assessment, and report. And last but not least is a multi-stakeholder climate engagement and mechanisms are strengthened with the information, using the information which is provided through the ETF. Next slide, please. With regard to second outcome, we are planning two outputs. The first is technical support and tools are provided to integrate in the system of ETF itself the periodic update of the NDCs and update of related documents such as NAPs, long-term low development strategies, and others, and to enable their implementation. And secondly, that mechanisms, models, scenarios are provided for translating the ETF information into evidence-based and data-driven climate policy making, which essentially means presenting all this information in a much more user-friendly way to be understood and taken on board by the decision makers with the view to allow for tracking the climate change impacts to the most vulnerable social groups, including gender and poverty, and also to take relevant actions and corrections. And I wish to conclude. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. By emphasizing that when we were designing the project proposal for the JEF CBIT project, we were guided by the vision that we are designing a project to establish national ETF that will definitely help to meet the legal requirements at the international level by Kyrgyzstan. That is a system that will enable domestic policy making and the system that would allow to attract much necessary climate finance and investments. And all this will be done for the purpose to improve the life of people of the country and also as a contribution to improving the health of the planet. Thank you very much for your attention.